Welcome to our session about using data to empower students through ELA goal setting. My name is Joan Jackson, and I am a Section 31A MTSS and Early Literacy Consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. I'm joined today by my colleague, Suzanne.
I'm Suzanne Grambush, and I'm also a consultant with Section 31A MTSS and Early Literacy. Welcome to today's session.
Let's take a look at our session objectives for today.
As we contemplate this school year and its unique challenges, we want to highlight a process that builds equity into our daily work, includes ongoing progress monitoring toward defined goals, and allows students to celebrate their individual milestones along the way. During today's session, we'll take a look at using data to create a challenge statement or improvement goal, and we'll share ideas on how to keep the identified goal in sight and make it actionable through the design and implementation of individual student ELA goals. By the end of our time today, we want you to have an understanding of how you might utilize data to collaborate with students in setting individual goals that ensure high levels of learning and engage all students in monitoring and celebrating their own learning and progress. We often talk about using data to drive instruction, and we know that having a clear understanding of students' strengths and areas of need helps us to design appropriate teaching objectives. Today, we'll talk about using that data to help students see where they are on their trajectory of learning and give them a voice in designing next steps in their learning. Let's start by looking at one teacher's experience.
The work we did surrounding student goal setting in the classroom was based on improving individual student NWEA achievement. In this case, student goal setting bridged the connection between assessments and learning. This was especially beneficial for younger students who may not yet understand the purpose of assessments. When students create and set goals for themselves, they become authors of their own learning. Motivation increases as they are driven by specific and meaningful goals. After all, students know themselves and their needs best. In the effort of managing many student goals, teachers and students can brainstorm goals that benefit the whole group. Teachers can also suggest steps or measures for students to take to reach their goals, but remember, we are just the facilitators. Student goal setting is not just about increasing student achievement, it is about empowering students to make relevant decisions regarding their learning. As I like to say to my students, take charge of your learning. And this work is going to be so incredibly important during this current context of remote and virtual teaching. Teachers should model setting attainable yet high achieving goals. For example, instead of simply telling my students that I had a goal to increase my reading comprehension, students were able to see me put that in action. I asked myself questions such as, how will I get there? What do I need to do? I made a plan of my lead measures, talked to a reading partner, and discussed characters, problems, and any questions I had while reading. My reading partner and I, who was their former kindergarten teacher, would frequently check in front of students to ensure we were following our learning trajectory. Through the use of leadership notebooks, students kept track of their goals and were able to reflect upon them by asking questions such as, did I meet my goals? Why or why not? What can I do differently in the future to reach my goals? And actually seeing their goals on paper in front of them, that physical representation of their goals, was really helpful for them to hold themselves accountable and for them to be thoughtful about their goals and to reflect. When students meet and surpass goals, they become the experts of goal setting and are able to support and encourage one another. This would not be possible without cultivating a culture of learning in the classroom.
Thank you to Hagan for the powerful exemplar of how student goal setting empowers student learning. Michigan Department of Education's Top 10 Strategic Education Plan outlines 8 goals one of which is improving early literacy achievement. Let's begin our data investigation by looking at some national and state level reading data.
In this session, we're going to go through an abbreviated database decision-making process looking at school, grade level, classroom, and individual student data. We'll select a building-wide challenge statement or improvement goal and see how the design of that one goal can become the focus of grade level, classroom, and individual student work in a way that is manageable and leads to results. We'll talk about teachers as students, collaborators, and coaches in jointly designing student goals, and we'll share ways to track progress and celebrate successes along the way. The objective today is to put a meaningful plan in place, but more than that, to have a plan that is actionable, one that every member of your learning community is working daily to impact. It really can happen, and it can help your educational community to make tracks toward equity and high levels of learning for all students. In August, MDE released our state's newly reimagined Top 10 Strategic Plan. Included as a top priority is improving early literacy achievement. Let's look at where Michigan stacks up in comparison to the nation on the National Assessment of Educational Performance, otherwise known as the NAEP reading assessment. This graph depicts the trends in fourth grade scale scores and gives a high-level view of how our fourth grade students in Michigan are performing in comparison to their peers across the nation. The NAEP reading assessment is given every other year, so the span of time shown here is 10 years. The blue line represents how fourth graders are performing on average across the nation. The green line represents fourth grade performance in Michigan. As you can see, from 2013 through 2017, there was a significant gap between the scale scores of our Michigan students and those of their national peers. On the 2019 NAEP reading assessment, the gap was narrowed because of a decline in the national data. However, our students still fall below the national average. It's also important to note here that these average scale scores fall in the NAEP basic range. The NAEP proficient range begins at 238. So while the average scale score was 218 for our students, and our students are making gains, there is still a lot of work to do. The NAEP website also provides the ranking of all states in the nation and includes Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and Department of Defense schools. Michigan's standing, according to this NAEP fourth grade reading data, is number 28 out of 53 according to the 2019 data. And we'll take a look at the website. If you visit the site, you can see all educational entities are listed, from 1 being the Department of Defense Educational Agency schools, then Massachusetts. As you scroll down, this strong green line here represents the national public school average, so the national average that we mentioned. And below the national public, you'll find Michigan here with our scale score, our average scale score of 218. As we mentioned, in our strategic plan outlines a path to becoming a top 10 state and improving early literacy outcomes for our students. That is a pivotal way to help us reach that goal. Most of you have recently administered a benchmark assessment or universal screener to help gain an understanding of student strengths and skill levels, and to help inform instructional decisions as you're beginning the school year. The recently passed Public Act 149, Section 104, subsection 8, requires schools to administer one or more of 4 K through 8 benchmark assessments twice per year, beginning this school year. Those MDE approved tests include assessments from NWEA, the MAP Growth, Curriculum Associates, which is iReady, Renaissance Learning, which brings us the STAR Reading Assessment, or DRC Beacon Assessment. A link to the guidance memo issued on August 21st, 2020 is provided on this slide. While MDE does not recommend one vendor over another, for the purpose of today's session, we will use mock reports from NWEA to look at sample data.
For today's exercise, we'll be using NWEA MAP growth data from a scenario at Bryce Canyon Elementary School. All data used for our purposes is created data and does not represent actual student data. As the building's continuous improvement team begins exploring areas of focus, they will contextualize their work alongside their district mission, vision, current priorities, and initiatives. This work will help the team identify potential areas of inquiry. Once a focus area is established, the team will select data sets to analyze, including aspects of the whole child, with a priority to identify patterns and trends. This information provides their data story. The team's data analysis has identified that 45% of students are below grade level proficiency in vocabulary acquisition and use, according to this benchmark assessment data. After looking at additional reading trend data, considering previous initiatives and district goals, conducting a root cause analysis and gap analysis, and together with grade level teachers, the team has collaboratively defined vocabulary acquisition and use as their focus for improvement in the upcoming year. And they've set a building-wide challenge or improvement goal to be 70% of students will meet proficiency in this area by the end of the 2021 school year, as evidenced by their benchmark assessment data.
Now we'll consider the sample data at the second grade level to see how this work connects to the building level plan. Let's look at how this data might inform next steps connected to the building focus. The data shows that currently in second grade, 40% of students scored in the low and low average ranges in the area of vocabulary acquisition and use. 46% of students scored in the low and low average ranges in the area of literature, and 48% of second graders scored in the low and low average range in informational text. All three of these academic areas require high quality Tier 1 instruction for all students. Looking specifically at vocabulary acquisition and use, we can see at this grade level, 60% of students are at or above grade level proficiency, and our goal, as we mentioned on the previous slide, is to have 70% of students proficient or above by the end of the year. This grade level data helps focus priorities for teaching and learning to begin to move the needle within each teacher's circle of control. While the data indicates need in other goal areas as well, the strategic focus on vocabulary and academic use aligns with the building level challenge goal and will also have a direct impact on overall reading achievement and specifically students' ability to read and comprehend text. As this building considers student needs, Tier 1 instruction, and opportunities for targeted Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention, and intentional planning of their MTSS, it's an appropriate time to explore how Section 31A planning and funding might be leveraged to support identified students' needs through their multi-tiered system of supports. Now we'll focus on the next level, an individual classroom report. It shows that in Ms. Ortega's second grade classroom, 26% of her students are scoring in the high or high average ranges in vocabulary acquisition and use, with approximately 75% of her students scoring below the national average. Of the 75%, 25% are scoring in the low range. Ms. Ortega's classroom goal includes moving those 25% of her students currently scoring in the low range in vocabulary acquisition and use to the average range and providing at least 1 year's growth in this area for the remainder of her class. In this way, she will be supporting the grade level and building challenge goals. We'll talk about the plan they will put in place to monitor their progress toward those goals. This class has good work to do, and it will be exciting to see the transition in those columns as the class hones their focus around systematically improving their vocabulary acquisition and use.
The recommended benchmark assessments provide classroom level data, banding groups of students according to areas of need. This, of course, is a great start toward finding common areas of need among groups of students to design meaningful small group strategy or skill instruction. This is also an appropriate time to consider how Section 31A funding might be used in a multi-tiered system of supports to address the needs identified by this data. This sample NWEA class breakdown by goal report uses student performance on the assessment to organize groups of students in bands along a continuum based on their current level of understanding. These bands identify the skills and knowledge that students have demonstrated, along with appropriate next steps in providing learning opportunities. Using this data, the classroom teacher can work with each student to collaboratively design an instructional goal based on individual needs in the area of vocabulary acquisition and use, in alignment with the building level focus. For the purpose of today's activity, we will select one student, John Rodriguez, to take a look at what goal setting might look like. This report shows where John falls in the continuum of learning as it relates to our focus area. It helps highlight John's strengths and areas of need and hones in on his zone of proximal development. By extracting this information on each student's just right level, where they fall on each strand and substrand, teachers are able to begin to design appropriate next steps. Armed with this information, and considering the variety of interventions that could take him to the next level of understanding, his teacher can begin to consider a possible pick list of opportunities and activities aligned with this band of knowledge that John could independently engage in to grow his vocabulary skills.
The next step is to analyze the information contained in John's individual student report. Using this information, the teacher can identify each student's specific level of understanding within the chosen area of focus and related to the overall challenge statement. The challenge statement, remember, related to improving students' ability to demonstrate proficiency in vocabulary acquisition and use. For second grade, these skills fall within standard L.2.4, which has to do with determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases. It informs the teacher specifically what sub-skills are most appropriate for a focus moving forward. The teacher would see that for substrand A, which has to do with using sentence level context to determine the meaning of a word or phrase, John was able to demonstrate his skills at a K1 grade band level. So this is the level that the teacher would want to provide activities for. The teacher would want to select activities that John can complete independently using K1 band words, and then build him up to working with words within his own grade level band. The teacher would select an activity that focuses on this area that is at his particular skill level in the K1 band. This activity becomes one of the choices on his pick list. It's related to the goal and can be accomplished independently. On the screen, you see an example activity selected and prepared by the teacher that John might choose to engage in throughout the week.
Continuing to look at John's data, we see his present level in relation to substrand B and the area most appropriate for focusing next steps. Here we see his need to build understanding around prefixes. The box on the right highlights data provided from the benchmark assessment regarding John's present level. Based on what he knows, the teacher will select an activity aligned to the standard with an appropriate degree of difficulty to support John in gaining skills on this trajectory of learning. The teacher will select an activity that allows John to work within his just right zone of proximal development to build on his demonstrated understanding in this area. Again, John's teacher selects an activity within the strand that is appropriate for his skill level. This activity becomes one of the choices on his pick list. It is related to the goal and can be accomplished by John working independently.
And finally, we see that John will also benefit from practice related to substrand D. Use knowledge of the meaning of individual words to predict the meaning of compound words. In the box on the right side, we see that John has already demonstrated the skill of applying understanding of word meaning to define a compound word, and he understands that individual words combine to form compound words. The teacher would select an activity in this area with words appropriate for his skill level to help John continue to progress toward accomplishing the overall goal of increasing vocabulary acquisition and use. Here's another sample of an activity the teacher may choose to add to John's pick list. As students feel the accomplishment of having achieved their self-selected goals, as they work at and accomplish tasks that are the just right amount of challenge, learning becomes fun and students are motivated. They're inspired and excited for the next challenge. Learning is student-centered and students can't help but see their own agency in the process.
Now it's time for Ms. Ortega to collaborate and coach. Together, she'll sit down with John and provide feedback on his present level of performance in this area. She'll highlight John's strengths and talk about this skill related to the challenge goal supports his growing reading skills. She might illuminate what skills along the trajectory look like in practice, and she'll invite John to share his perspectives, questions, and goals. Having a clear understanding of John's present level and identifying the variety of learning opportunities that are appropriate for his next steps in learning, John is ready to begin deciding how he will approach the work ahead. Now, Ms. Ortega will provide John with the list of options from those she's determined to be in line with his learning objectives. John reviews the options and chooses the activity he will engage in, and will also decide on which days of the week he will take part in the activity and for how long. Together, they will complete the goal-setting sheet, identifying his current level and his goal for midway through the year. The activities are prepped and ready for John to choose from. This type of goal-setting conversation gives students choice and empowers them to be leaders in their learning. By working individually with each student and making an action plan for growth, students are able to choose a goal and select an activity that is just right for them to engage in independently. Each of the choices the teacher provides aligns with appropriate next steps in a student's learning. The student chooses the activity, where and when, and the number of times each week they will engage in their chosen activity. Each week, the teacher checks in with the class to monitor progress toward the goal. For example, one student may choose an activity and agree to engage in it 4 times a week during class enrichment intervention time. Each week, the teacher gathers information related to how many times out of the total the student met the commitment. Celebrating students' part in achieving identified goals keeps the dream alive. As students are able to see progress and celebrate their part in reaching designated goals, they begin to see their agency in improvement efforts. They see how their actions lead to results. The class can track their data and celebrate progress toward meeting their individual as well as classroom goals. There are a variety of ways to report data. For example, the teacher might ask students to report how many times they engaged in their selected activity throughout the week. The teacher would compile the information and report the findings in a way that is visible to the class. For example, 75% of students met their goal, or 60% of interventions took place in our classroom this week. Students drive the measure, and the classroom celebrates their combined success toward the commitments they've made toward individual goals. The focus of our session today was how we might ensure we have an improvement plan that is operational. How do we take the good work we've done in analyzing data, determining strengths and areas of need, and keep those narrow areas of focus at the fore throughout the year? How do we get the whole community on board with our area of focus? To do that, we need all hands on deck, everyone working together with a focus on the designated goal. In our example, the goal is increasing proficiency in vocabulary acquisition and use. Keeping the focus starts with maintaining attention on the measures that impact the goal. Among those measures, the work students are doing. Customarily, we measure our progress toward goals by analyzing how our academic performance data changes over time. It's often difficult to stay connected to an improvement goal, as it's difficult to see or measure the incremental changes in student understanding as a result of daily instruction and learning. Using this process, measuring that which we, teachers and students, control in the classroom, will allow you to celebrate your work toward the goal and ultimately see the needle move in raising student achievement. One way to keep your improvement goal at the fore, to keep it in focus for all stakeholders in ways that are relevant and allow us to see our progress, is to measure and celebrate those things that are, of course, aligned to our goal, but also those things we have agency over and are touching in an ongoing way. So what we're going to measure is students' effort toward goals. We're going to collaborate with each student to identify an appropriate goal based on data, allow the student to choose an action plan that includes an activity they choose to take part in, how many times each week and for how long they'll engage in the activity. Then each week, students will report out on progress in meeting the goal that they helped design. We measure students' effort toward their goal. Measuring effort rather than achievement empowers students. Effort rather than achievement alone creates passion, allows students to see their agency, and leads students to take control of their learning. There's a lot of good work to be done to take our state to the top 10, and by creating environments where students' individual needs are considered, their voice is part of the planning process, and each student is given the just right amount of challenge each day, we'll have classrooms where students are engaged, motivated, and inspired, and where students recognize their agency in making their dreams come true.
Thank you so much for viewing our presentation. If you have any questions or would like some additional information, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our contact information is listed on this slide.